Thanks for being here, everyone. My name is David J. Nelson, and this is my talk, The Art of Esoteric Attack Chaining. I've been a security consultant at Reversec for the past 3 years, but I've spent almost half my life obsessed with offensive security. One of my favorite things in offensive security is not just finding vulnerabilities, but finding interesting and creative ways to chain vulnerabilities together, or using vulnerabilities that are barely vulnerabilities and using them to escalate the impact of certain other issues. Today I'm going to be telling you a story about how I found a series of web application vulnerabilities during a security assessment, and I was able to combine these to create a highly impactful exploit chain, which required no user interaction. Alone, these vulnerabilities only affected the web application, but combined, they had effects on the entire network. The impact of this finding ranged from intellectual property theft, credential exposure, and even persistent developer compromise. And maybe the worst impact of all, some people had to drive back to the office on a Friday. This story starts with the discovery of a single high severity vulnerability in the web application, which allowed me to impersonate admin users of that application. Next, I discovered a container flaw in the infrastructure that powered the application. And this appeared to be a high severity vulnerability at first, but I soon realized that it had actually almost no security impact on its own. Next, I found the same vulnerability again, but in an unexpected place in a different part of the application. And this discovery actually ended up being the link that led me down the path to trying to chain these vulnerabilities together. I spent a while trying to actually succeed at chaining them together, and every time I encountered a hurdle that I was able to overcome, I ended up encountering another one. So for a while, I almost gave up on trying to chain them together and just figured I'd report them as individual vulnerabilities. But eventually, I was successful in creating an exploit chain. This application was the company's web-based development platform. This is where developers would write, test, and execute code. It was actually two closely related apps. We'll call them the Portal UI and the developer platform. The Portal UI was primarily used for project management of developer projects, and the developer platform was where the core functionality was. This is what contains most of the interesting features. Because it was two different applications, I split the assessment into two different parts, starting with the Portal UI. So the Portal UI used cookie-based authentication. Every request had a unique cookie with a unique token that identified the users. And one of the first things I noticed is that the cookie contained a username, which isn't especially typical. And so I asked myself a ridiculous question: what happens if I just change it? Is that going to be enough for me to impersonate other users? And much to my surprise, it actually worked. Switching the username to an admin username was enough for me to impersonate a portable admin and execute certain admins that only an admin would be able to do. Apparently, no token validation was happening here, and I could actually just remove everything in the cookie besides the username, and the request would still succeed. So, admin impersonation in a website is obviously not good. Did that mean I had full control over the application? Not quite. So some of the things I could do were things like username enumeration and viewing projects that I wasn't authorized to view, getting their IDs, but some of the other things I couldn't do were a lot of the more impactful things, like creating users and promoting them to super user, adding myself to other projects unauthorized, and deleting projects. Things that in this site an attacker would be especially interested in. Still, I reported this as a high severity vulnerability, and I continued testing. That was actually the only finding during the Portal UI part of the assessment, and so soon I moved on to testing the developer platform, which is where most of those interesting features were. So what makes it so interesting? For one thing, it used the same cookies that the Portal UI used, but it also had an additional authorization mechanism, which I'll get into a little bit more later. It also had some interesting features, including functions, which if you're familiar with AWS, these are like lambdas, jobs, which are like functions that you can schedule to run at regular intervals. And then there were sessions and environments, and it was less clear what made these interesting from a security perspective, but they ended up becoming much more important. So what are they? So environments are self-contained development environment configurations. You could choose from predefined code libraries when creating the environment. And interestingly, there was also an option to include a custom post-update script. This was a script you could write that would perform certain system configurations. You could use it to install additional utilities. And you could think of environments like a building block for sessions or jobs. Now, sessions are an in-browser interface where developers write, test, and execute their code. This is what they would actually launch from the application, which would bring them to the interface where they do their developing. Sessions are containerized, so every time a session is created, a self-contained tiny Linux machine is created, which contains everything needed to power the session. And when creating sessions, you could choose that custom environment you just created a little bit ago, and this would control what code libraries were installed when the session starts. And interestingly, the environment's post-update script would execute immediately as soon as the session was created. So understanding environments and sessions is important because this is what led me to the second discovery, a container flaw in the infrastructure of the application. So to do what the post-update script needed to do, it needed to have root or full privileges in the container. This is fine if you trust your users to implicitly to use it how it's supposed to be used, but there weren't actually any limitations on what can be written into the script. So you could, for example, create a post-update script that modifies the user permissions file in the session container. That way, when you access this session, you could elevate to root after the fact. For those familiar with container security, being in a privileged container can often mean you have the ability to break out of the container, but root in the container is not the same thing as being in a privileged container. If implemented properly, you could have root in a container and it'll likely have no real security implications because the container itself is secure. The company was very aware of container breakout concerns. It was actually one of the things they mentioned during the scoping call, and they had implemented proper security measures, being thing I knew of to break out of the container, but ultimately all my attempts were unsuccessful. So I noted this as a low severity and I continued testing. I started to wonder though, what if that first vulnerability also existed in this application? If it did, where would I find it? So remember, the first vulnerability allowed for user impersonation. And given the interesting developer features and code execution features of the developer platform, I figured if I could impersonate another user here, that sounds a lot like being able to execute code as another user. Things like functions and jobs would be particularly interesting for this sort of finding. But the one problem was that additional authorization layer. So in addition to the cookie, every request was also sent with an authorization header which had an encoded employee username and password. So the username in the cookie would need to match the password. If I wanted to try and exploit this, I would have to change both. But I would also need to know the correct password of the employee, and if I already knew that, exploiting this would be kind of pointless. So, try as I may, impersonation was unsuccessful in most cases in the application due to this very thing. But as it turns out, sessions were the one exception. I was able to create sessions as other users just by switching the username in the cookie. Apparently that same authorization check wasn't taking place here. So perfect, I can create sessions as other users, but what's the real impact here? After all, the user would still need to actually access the session to do anything with it, and it doesn't have the same automatic code execution capabilities that functions or jobs do. So to answer this question, I began an investigative journey to discover everything I could, to learn everything I could about sessions. I began creating sessions and exploring the containers, and soon I made an interesting discovery that the user's network attached directory is mounted in the container when the session starts. So this directory was sort of like a developer's main project directory, and the purpose of this was so that if you're writing code in a session and you end up destroying the session, you don't lose all your progress because everything is kept in the directory. So you could just start a new session and continue from where you left off. Being a developer's directory, this would contain code and project data, possibly personal information, and could even contain developer credentials. So the question became, if I can create a session as another user, can I then access that session and access the data within? But it turns out I couldn't do that. Even though the session was visible to me in the UI as well as to the impersonated user, only the person who was impersonated was able to access the session. So I could see it, but I couldn't access it. And the team confirmed that this was by design and that sessions could not be shared between users, even legitimate ones. So I can't access the session directly, and I can't use it to execute code, but what about that post-update script? If I could create an environment with a post-update script that accesses the user's directory and then impersonate them and create a session specifying that environment, couldn't I leverage this post-update script to access their data for me without really having to do anything other than switching a username in the cookie? But I couldn't do that either. The first problem was that the root user and all its privileges couldn't actually access the network drive. Network file systems are often configured to explicitly disallow root users, and that was the case here as well. So I figured the solution was easy. I just create a post-update script, add a command in the beginning to switch the user to the one I'm trying to impersonate, and then I could access the directory or do whatever it is that I wanted to do with a post-update script. And that's when I encountered the bigger and stranger problem, which was that the user and their directory didn't even exist at the time that the post-update script was executing. All of this apparently happened after the post-update script was finished. It seemed they had thought of everything to make this root in the container issue not an issue at all. So at this point, I'm starting to think maybe I should just report these as separate findings and give up on linking this chain. But before giving up, I felt it was worth taking a step back and assessing everything that I knew. So what do I know so far? I know that I have no direct access to the session. I know that the mounted user directory in the session is the only thing of value. Otherwise, it's just a default Linux container with nothing interesting to an attacker. And I know that root is not allowed to access it, but even if it was, the user and directory doesn't even exist yet. But it does exist at some point. At some point during session startup, there must be a process executing as the regular user. Otherwise, how does the directory get mounted if root can't access it? I just need to figure out what this process is and how to interact with it in some way. I also know that I have never tried this hard to not get root. So I can't use the post-update script to exploit directly, but I can use it to gather some information and do some reconnaissance. And that's exactly what I did. I began creating session after session, trying different post-update scripts, enumerating network services, the file system, and listing startup process IDs, and that's when I found it. This file was everything. This file was completely responsible for initializing everything in the session, and so I figure if that's the case, this is the only process running, this must be responsible for creating the user, mounting the directory, so once again, I reasoned that the solution is simple. I just use the post-update script to inject my payload into the end of this file. That way, at that point, the user would have been created, the directory would be mounted, and anything I inject into that process would be running as the regular user. But I was wrong about that too. I figured at this point, though, it was I've come a little bit too far to give up, and exploitation was more a matter of how and less a matter of if. So I began reading through every line of the start.sh file. There was only a few hundred to go through, but nothing was jumping out at me at first, until I found it. One unassuming environment variable which appeared to reference the user. There was a few lines of code that dealt with this variable, and these lines appeared to create the user, mount the directory, and after that it would switch back to executing as root, which is why my injected payload didn't work. So finally, I felt I actually have all the pieces at this point to construct an exploit. And this was the solution, a rather simple post-update script. What this did is writes a payload to the file system. It then injects a line into the start.sh file, in line 255 specifically, which references that variable and executes the payload I just created as the non-root user. And the result is that the payload would access the user's directory during session startup and theoretically exfiltrate the data to a remote server. Obviously, this was a customer environment, so I'm not going to actually execute a malicious payload and actually steal data. So what the payload actually did is it just listed the contents of the user's home directory and printed the username just to prove access and execution. And then it sent that data it encoded that data and sent it to a Reversec controlled server. The server receives it, decodes that data, and prints it, proving the data exfiltration proof of concept. So how might this play out in a real attack scenario? The attacker would create an environment with the malicious post-update script. They would then create the new session and specify that malicious environment in the request. But before completing the request, they would intercept it, swap the username in the cookie, and send the request off, at which point the session is created immediately, which would run the post-update script, and this injects the payload into the session's main startup script, the start.sh file, causing it to execute as the regular user. And the important thing to note here is that no user interaction is actually required. The user never clicks a link, no phishing happens, they don't actually have to access the session. This all happens without them knowing. So I've been talking a lot about data exfiltration, but theoretically, depending on what the attacker does, it could be a lot worse. Impact largely depends on what is in the home directory, but instead of exfiltrating data, the attacker could potentially inject a backdoor into the user's home directory where there are lots of different types of startup scripts, depending on the environment. And remember, the home directory persists, so all the attacker would have to do is execute this attack one time, backdoor the home directory, and this would follow the developer around wherever their home directory is mounted into a container or a development environment, leading to that persistent developer compromise. I think it's important to note that as soon as I realized the full impact and gave the customer the steps to reproduce, they were incredibly proactive and fixed it that day, hence the driving back into the office on Friday. And they fixed it in a way that I wasn't actually expecting. And I assumed they would address the higher severity of the two issues, the cookie impersonation flaw, but they actually fixed the container issue first, and they did this by making sure that a temporary user is created and that the post-update script would execute as that user. It had permissions to do certain things like installing additional utilities, modifying, making certain system configuration changes, but it didn't have full access to write to every file in the container, so I couldn't use it to backdoor the start.sh file, for example. I think this is a really good example of how findings with seemingly no security impact can be used as gadgets or can be used to dramatically increase the impact of other vulnerabilities, even if the vulnerabilities seem to be pretty unrelated. If this assessment had been conducted differently, in my case, both the web applications were in scope and everything within, so container issues as well, but it's not uncommon to see that perhaps these two applications would be assessed in different individual assessments, or maybe more likely, both applications would be in scope, but container issues are not in scope. This is just a web application test. And they did do a really good job of securing the containers. Technically, there wasn't any real issue with the container security on its own. It was only being able to chain these together that made it impactful. If that had been the case, and these findings were found in two totally different assessments, the customer could have been exposed to the potential for developer compromise for weeks instead of having it fixed that day. So one of the things I took away from this is that it's really important whenever possible to have a holistic view of your security, your infrastructure, your technology. Compartmentalization is efficient, but it can often lead to blind spots. It allows us to hone in on certain aspects of our environment very well, but I think in security we learn time and time again that some of the most impactful vulnerabilities lie in the integration layer, in the way that individual components communicate and interact. Thank you.